Power can elevate a person to greatness, but it can also crush them without mercy. And in the history of Europe, women who held power often paid a price far heavier than men. They were judged not only for their politics, but for their emotions, their affections, even their tears. Among them, few stories are as tragic as that of Hana of Castile, the queen remembered by a haunting name, Hana the Mad. Legend tells us she wandered across Spain, dragging her husband's coffin, whispering to his lifeless body, unable to accept his death. These tales, repeated over centuries, hardened into history's verdict. And so she was branded, forever, as the queen who lost her mind. But what if that story is a lie? What if the madness we have been taught to see was not madness at all, but the result of a calculated conspiracy? What if Hana was never insane, but instead a woman betrayed by the men closest to her, her husband, her father, and even her son, who found it easier to call her mad than to accept her authority? This is not just the tale of a queen imprisoned. It is the story of how love can become a shackle, how grief can be twisted into a weapon, and how a crown can become a cage. Hana of Castile, the woman the world calls mad, was in truth the victim of one of the most ruthless campaigns of political manipulation in Renaissance Europe. Hana of Castile was born in 1479 into a world where power was not just inherited, but forged through fire, faith, and fear. Her parents, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, were the architects of a newly unified Spain. Together, they had expelled the Moors from Granada, launched the Inquisition to enforce religious conformity, and expelled the Jews in one of the darkest moments of Spanish history. They were celebrated across Christendom as the Catholic monarchs, a title that carried with it not just prestige, but the weight of an empire that demanded absolute obedience. Into this atmosphere of triumph and terror, Hana entered the world. She was not born to be an ordinary child. From her earliest years, she displayed a spark that set her apart from her siblings. Tutors marveled at her intelligence. She absorbed knowledge with an intensity that alarmed as much as it impressed. She learned Latin with the ease of a scholar, mastered French and Flemish, and displayed a sharp grasp of theology and philosophy. While other young royals were content to mimic court rituals, Hana asked questions about justice, about faith, about the nature of duty itself. But in an age where women were expected to be silent ornaments of dynastic policy, such curiosity was dangerous. Spain in the late 15th century was not a place that encouraged independent thought, especially not from a princess. The newly established Inquisition had made sure of that. The lesson was clear: independent thinking led to heresy, and heresy led to the flames of the stake. For Hana, growing up in such an environment meant that every word, every glance, every gesture was being judged not just by her tutors, but by the shadow of the church and crown. Her parents did not raise their children to be individuals. They raised them as instruments. Every child of Ferdinand and Isabella was a bargaining chip in the great game of dynastic politics. Their eldest son Juan was to inherit both Castile and Aragon, binding the kingdoms permanently. Their daughters were destined to be married into the great houses of Europe, each one a key to new alliances, a safeguard against rivals, or a tool to secure influence in distant courts. Hana was no exception. From birth, her life was mapped out as part of the grand design. Her education reflected this harsh reality. She was taught to read not just religious texts but political situations. She learned that a smile might hide a dagger, that loyalty could turn to treachery in an instant, and that trust was a luxury no ruler could afford. She was trained not just to obey but to observe, to analyze, and to remember. These lessons were meant to make her useful. But they also made her dangerous. For Hana did not simply memorize, she understood. She connected ideas, drew her own conclusions, and showed a depth of feeling that unnerved those around her. It was precisely this emotional depth that would later be turned against her. In a world where men's passions were seen as strength but women's emotions were seen as weakness, Hana was already marked for tragedy. The same qualities that would have been celebrated in a male heir, curiosity, intensity, conviction, were reframed as signs of instability in her. Even as a young girl, whispers followed her, that she was too sensitive, too questioning, too alive to her own thoughts. These whispers, planted early, would later grow into accusations of madness. But for the moment, she was still a princess, moving in the glittering yet suffocating world of her parents' court. It was a court defined by paranoia as much as by splendor. Ferdinand and Isabella ruled through a combination of shrewd calculation and ruthless elimination of rivals. They had built their empire on the careful use of marriage alliances, on betrayals executed at just the right moment, and on the systematic suppression of anyone who dared oppose their vision of a unified Catholic Spain. Within this system, Hana's life was never her own. Before she was even old enough to understand the weight of marriage, her future had been decided. She was promised to Philip of Burgundy, the son of Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor. This was no ordinary betrothal. It was a masterstroke of strategy. By marrying Hana into the Habsburg line, Spain would join its fortunes with one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. Together, these two families could dominate the continent, creating an axis of power that stretched from Iberia to Central Europe. For Ferdinand and Isabella, it was the perfect move. For Hana, it was a sentence passed before she had ever spoken her vows. Even as a child, she sensed what lay ahead. Marriage for royal daughters was not about love, not about companionship, but about territory and treaties. Still, she did not rebel. She absorbed the expectations placed upon her, even as she struggled with the tension between duty and self. Her tutors noticed her quiet determination, the way she carried herself with dignity even when she was corrected, the way she seemed to see more than she was supposed to. But her parents began to worry. Not because she lacked intelligence or devotion, but because she had too much of both. An independent-minded daughter might question, might resist, might refuse to be the pliant consort required for such a monumental alliance. And yet, the gears of politics had already turned too far to stop. Her marriage contract was sealed, her future predetermined. As she grew into adolescence, the walls closed in around her. The Spanish court was not a place of freedom but a chessboard. And Hana was one of the most valuable pieces on it. Every move she made was scrutinized. Every word she spoke was weighed. She could already feel the invisible bars of the cage that would soon close around her life. Her childhood, if it can be called that, was not a time of innocence. It was an apprenticeship in survival. She learned early that in her world, truth mattered less than perception, and perception could be twisted at will. She learned that women could be praised for their piety in one breath and condemned for their passion in the next. She learned that even within her own family, she was both loved and feared, nurtured and controlled. By the time she reached her teens, Hana had become a paradox. She was both prepared and unprepared for the future ahead. Prepared because she understood the language of politics, the rituals of power, the responsibilities of rule. Unprepared because nothing in her sheltered but suffocating life could teach her how to navigate the cruelty of the man she was destined to marry. What began as a childhood marked by intelligence and promise would soon transform into a womanhood defined by betrayal and loss. For the very qualities that made Hana extraordinary were the same ones her enemies would later exploit, twisting her intellect into suspicion, her passion into hysteria, her grief into madness. The stage was set, and the actors were ready. The girl who had once asked too many questions was about to step into a world where every answer had already been decided for her. And so, with the ink dry on her marriage contract and the sails of a great fleet waiting to carry her across the seas, Hana's fate moved inexorably toward the man history would call her husband, and the world would remember as her destroyer. At 16, Hana of Castile's life was no longer her own. She was not simply a young woman leaving childhood behind, she was a living vessel of political ambition, packed onto ships and sent across the seas as though she were the most valuable cargo in Europe. Her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, had prepared a fleet of more than 100 vessels to escort her to the Low Countries, where she would wed Philip of Burgundy, better known to history as Philip the Handsome. The sheer scale of the journey spoke volumes. It was not merely a marriage, it was the merging of dynasties, the consolidation of power between Spain and the rising Habsburg Empire. The crossing was treacherous. Storms lashed the convoy, waves rising high enough to threaten even the most seaworthy ships. For Hana, still little more than a girl, the danger was immediate and visceral. She clutched at rosaries, whispered prayers, and felt the spray of the sea sting her face as the ship pitched and rolled. When she finally set foot on Flemish soil, she had already been marked by trauma. And yet, the greatest storm of her life awaited her not on the ocean, but in the glittering halls of Burgundy. Philip the Handsome lived up to his name. Tall, broad-shouldered, with golden hair and striking blue eyes, he possessed a charm that could disarm even the most cynical of courtiers. When Hana first laid eyes on him in October 1496, the air itself seemed to change. Witnesses wrote of an electric moment, a charge of passion between the two young royals. She was smitten immediately, swept away by the kind of love that defies reason. The marriage that followed was celebrated across Europe. Nobles and diplomats saw it as the dawn of a new superpower. The union of Castile, Aragon, and Burgundy meant a continent-spanning alliance that could challenge even France and the papacy. The wedding feast was an extravagant spectacle of music, jewels, silks, and pageantry. To the outside world, it looked as though destiny itself had smiled on Hana of Castile. But behind the grandeur, the story was very different. Hana's love for Philip was total. She gave herself to him without reservation, pouring into him a devotion so fierce it frightened her contemporaries. But for Philip, marriage was not a sanctuary. It was a stage. He enjoyed her beauty and her passion, but he treated both as things to be possessed, not cherished. To him, Hana's loyalty was not a gift to be reciprocated but a duty he believed he was owed. Philip was a man of appetites. Women, in particular, were his weakness. In the sophisticated court of Burgundy, where flirtation and intrigue were woven into daily life, he pursued mistresses openly. Hana, young and inexperienced, was not prepared for the humiliation of seeing her husband's conquests paraded in front of her. At banquets, at court functions, even in the corridors of her new home, Philip made little effort to conceal his betrayals. Her reaction was the most human one imaginable: jealousy, grief, and outrage. She confronted him, she wept, she pleaded. But in a world where men's passions were seen as strength and women's emotions as hysteria, her pain was twisted against her. Courtiers whispered that she was unstable, that her moods were excessive, that her devotion bordered on obsession. What was natural grief for betrayal became, in their eyes, a symptom of madness. The cruelty was deliberate. Philip discovered quickly that by alternating attention with neglect, he could control his wife's every move. When he showered her with affection, she glowed. When he withdrew into cold indifference or flaunted another woman, she fell into despair. This cycle of manipulation tightened around her like a noose. Each time she resisted, each time she expressed anger, it was carefully noted, documented, and passed along as proof of her volatility. Despite the pain, Hana adapted to life in Burgundy with remarkable intelligence. She learned Dutch, embraced Flemish customs, and impressed courtiers with her wit and political insight. Her natural talents should have made her an asset to Philip, a partner in diplomacy and governance. Instead, they made her a threat. A queen consort with her own ideas, her own voice, her own mind, this was not what Philip wanted. In 1498, their first child, Eleanor, was born. For a time, the arrival of the baby softened Philip's demeanor. He treated Hana with more tenderness, visited her chamber, and allowed the semblance of marital harmony. But these brief interludes were only respites. Soon, he returned to his conquests, leaving Hana once again to grapple with the contradiction of being both cherished and discarded. 2 years later, she gave birth to their son, Charles, the boy who would one day become Holy Roman Emperor. Again, Philip appeared to draw closer, only to withdraw once the novelty faded. To Hana, every child she bore was both a bond and a wound, proof of her devotion, but also a reminder of the love she could never truly secure. Meanwhile, reports began to filter back to Spain. Courtiers described Hana as moody, jealous, and prone to emotional outbursts. These accounts, stripped of context, alarmed Ferdinand and Isabella. They feared that their daughter's behavior might threaten the crucial alliance they had orchestrated. Yet none of them asked the deeper question: why was she so distressed? The idea that Philip's cruelty might be the cause was rarely entertained. Instead, the narrative of Hana's instability gained traction. Philip's court became a theater where her every move was scrutinized. Her tears were recorded as weakness, her anger as dangerous temper, her pleas for fidelity as irrational jealousy. Slowly, the myth began to grow: Hana of Castile was not simply a passionate wife, she was a woman unfit for power. And yet, beneath this campaign of distortion, the truth was far more complicated. Hana was not irrational. She was responding to betrayal in the only way she knew how, with passion, with grief, with fury. She loved too deeply in a world that demanded women feel less. She demanded honesty in a marriage built on politics and deceit. She wanted loyalty from a man who saw loyalty as optional. What made this tragedy all the more devastating was that Hana never stopped loving Philip. Despite the humiliation, despite the cruelty, despite the wounds he inflicted, she clung to him with a desperation born of both affection and survival. In a foreign land, far from her family, surrounded by courtiers loyal to her husband, Philip was not only her tormentor but also her anchor. Losing him, she feared, would mean losing everything. The seeds of her downfall had been sown. What began as a marriage meant to unite empires had become a crucible that would break her spirit and define her legacy. The same passion that fueled her love would be used against her. The same grief that proved her humanity would be twisted into proof of insanity. And the same crown that should have empowered her would become the chain that bound her. For now, though, she remained devoted, determined to make her marriage work. But history was already moving against her. In the shadows, whispers grew louder. And soon, tragedy would strike not just in her marriage, but in her family, propelling Hana of Castile from a betrayed wife into the heir to the most powerful throne in Europe, a position that would seal her fate forever. For several years after her wedding, Hana of Castile lived in a strange balance between splendor and sorrow. On the surface, she was Duchess of Burgundy, a consort in one of Europe's most sophisticated courts, surrounded by riches, culture, and diplomacy. Yet behind the glittering facade, her marriage to Philip the Handsome was unraveling. His infidelities were open, his cruelty deliberate, and her devotion increasingly weaponized against her. At first, her suffering seemed like a private tragedy, the heartbreak of a young woman whose love was not returned. But in 1497, fate struck with a cruelty that changed not just Hana's life but the destiny of Spain itself. That year, her brother Juan, the only male heir to Ferdinand and Isabella, died unexpectedly at just 19. Spain had pinned its hopes on him. He was meant to carry forward the dynastic project of uniting Castile and Aragon under a single crown. His death sent shockwaves through the realm. In the space of weeks, the carefully constructed succession plans of Ferdinand and Isabella crumbled. The burden of inheritance shifted to Hana's elder sister, Isabella, who had married into the Portuguese royal family. For a time, it seemed Spain would be joined to Portugal in one vast Iberian union. But fate was merciless. Within a year, this Isabella too was dead, along with her infant son Miguel. One by one, the heirs who stood before Hana in the line of succession vanished. By 1500, the unthinkable had happened. Hana, once considered a secondary daughter destined only for marriage politics, was now the heir to the most powerful throne in Europe. With Castile and Aragon in her bloodline, and with territories in Italy, North Africa, and the newly claimed lands of the Americas, her inheritance was nothing short of an empire. What should have been her triumph became the foundation of her downfall. Hana's new position changed everything in her marriage. Philip, who had previously treated her emotions with contempt, now viewed her as the gateway to unimaginable power. His attitude shifted, not out of love, but out of ambition. He began to present himself as her stabilizing partner, the rational husband who could guide his fragile wife in matters of rule. Courtiers close to him whispered that Spain would be stronger with Philip as king, not Hana as queen. Her father Ferdinand, meanwhile, watched with growing alarm from Spain. He had spent decades carefully consolidating power, building an empire rooted in Catholic unity. He had no intention of handing all of that over to a Flemish son-in-law he despised. Philip, to Ferdinand, represented everything Spain should fear: foreign influence, frivolous courtly culture, and dangerous arrogance. Thus, a deadly struggle began to take shape. Both her husband and her father sought to use the same weapon against her: her emotions. They began to collect stories, to document her distress, to build a case that Hana was not fit to rule. The accusations of instability that had once circulated as idle gossip now hardened into a narrative. Every tear she shed was noted. Every argument with Philip was transformed into evidence. Every act of devotion became a sign of dependency. To Philip's supporters, she was too fragile to rule without him. To Ferdinand's allies, she was too unstable to rule without her father. Both sides agreed on one thing: Hana herself could not be trusted with her own crown. In 1502, Hana and Philip traveled to Spain so the Cortes could formally recognize her as heir. It should have been her moment of glory, a procession through her homeland as the future queen. Instead, it became a public stage for the campaign against her. When she wept at being separated from Philip, observers declared her overly dependent. When she asserted herself in council, she was called hysterical. If she showed kindness, it was dismissed as naivete. If she showed anger, it was cited as proof of instability. Her every gesture was twisted, reinterpreted, and weaponized. Among the nobility of Castile, doubts grew. Some had hoped Hana might bring strong leadership, a queen capable of balancing her parents' iron rule with compassion. But as whispers of her madness spread, many turned cautious. To support her openly was to risk being on the losing side of a dynastic struggle. Slowly, deliberately, she was isolated. Meanwhile, Philip acted not as consort but as king-in-waiting. He gathered a circle of Flemish advisers, asserted authority at councils, and often answered questions directed to Hana as if she were invisible. It was a calculated humiliation, reducing her presence in her own court, training others to see her as secondary, even irrelevant. The tragedy was that Hana's intelligence remained sharp. She could follow diplomatic discussions with ease. She knew the politics of Europe as well as any prince. Foreign ambassadors noted her fluency in languages, her grasp of statecraft, her genuine concern for her people. But none of this mattered. The narrative of madness was too useful. It drowned out the truth. The death of Queen Isabella of Castile in 1504 brought the crisis to its breaking point. As her mother's heir, Hana should have ascended to the throne immediately. But Ferdinand moved quickly, declaring himself regent and arguing that his daughter was unfit to rule. From Flanders, Philip began to raise an army, preparing to claim Castile not as consort but as king in his own right. Hana was trapped. Two men claimed to love her, yet both were fighting not for her, but for control of what she represented. Her emotions, her grief, her loyalty, all of it was reinterpreted through their competing narratives. If she sided with her father, Philip's camp declared she was being manipulated. If she sided with Philip, Ferdinand's allies argued it proved her poor judgment. For Hana, the crown that should have been liberation became a chain. She was no longer simply a wife suffering betrayal. She was the contested prize of European politics. And in this contest, her own voice was irrelevant. The woman who legally held the crown of Castile was silenced, her authority stripped away under the guise of protection. What the world saw was a daughter cared for by her father, a wife stabilized by her husband. What Hana experienced was something very different: the theft of her autonomy, the slow erasure of her identity, and the transformation of her love and grief into weapons used against her. She was heir to an empire. But in reality, she was already becoming a prisoner. By the early 1500s, Hana of Castile had become the center of a dangerous game. She was no longer simply the passionate wife of Philip the Handsome, nor merely the dutiful daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon. She was the legal heir to Castile, Aragon, and all the territories that came with them, an empire stretching across Europe, North Africa, and the newly claimed lands in the Americas. To possess her was to possess power. And so, both her husband and her father set about proving that she was incapable of ruling on her own. The campaign against Hana was subtle at first. Whispers moved through court corridors, reports circulated in foreign embassies, and careful notes were taken of her every word, every outburst, every tear. Philip's courtiers documented her jealousy over his mistresses, framing it not as natural heartbreak but as irrational hysteria. Ferdinand's agents did the same, recording her moments of grief or defiance as evidence of instability. Slowly, deliberately, a web was spun around her, one strand at a time. The tragedy was that Hana's behavior was not extraordinary. Any woman in her position, isolated in a foreign land, betrayed by her husband, manipulated by her father, would have felt despair, anger, or longing. Yet in an age that feared female emotion, her reactions were not interpreted as human but as pathological. What was expected of her was silence. What she offered instead was honesty. And for that, she was punished. In 1502, she and Philip traveled to Spain so the Cortes could formally recognize her as heir. For Hana, the journey should have been triumphant, a return to her homeland as future queen. Instead, it was a public display of scrutiny. She was watched constantly, her every gesture weighed against the question, was she fit to rule? When she wept at being separated from Philip, courtiers said she was too dependent. When she displayed assertiveness in council, they whispered of hysteria. If she laughed too loudly, it was evidence of instability. If she withdrew into silence, it was proof of melancholy. No matter what she did, it was interpreted in the worst possible light. Philip encouraged this narrative, positioning himself as the calm, rational counterpart to his emotional wife. He spoke for her at councils, answered questions directed at her, and reminded everyone that Spain needed stability, something, he implied, only he could provide. Ferdinand, from the other side, used similar tactics. He emphasized that his daughter was fragile, unable to govern without the steady hand of her father. Two men with opposite interests but identical methods, both painting Hana as unfit, both presenting themselves as the solution. The nobility of Castile grew uneasy. Many had hoped Hana would rule with strength, perhaps offering a more balanced reign than her iron-willed mother, Isabella. But with accusations of instability coming from both her father and her husband, doubts spread. To support her was to risk backing someone the world now saw as unstable. To oppose her was to align with men who promised stability. Slowly, her natural allies fell away. The most insidious part of this campaign was how her intelligence was twisted into proof of madness. When she demonstrated knowledge of complex diplomatic issues, courtiers claimed her understanding was superficial. When she showed compassion for her subjects, it was dismissed as naivete. When she spoke passionately about betrayal, it was rebranded as hysteria. Every strength became a weakness through the dark alchemy of politics. By 1504, the whispers had grown into a chorus. Foreign diplomats began writing home about the madness of the Spanish heir, not as rumor but as fact. The repetition gave these claims weight, burying the truth beneath layers of distortion. Hana was being convicted in absentia, condemned by voices she could not confront, in courts where she had no voice. The death of her mother Isabella in November 1504 brought the situation to a crisis. As queen, Isabella had held Castile together with iron resolve. Her passing left a vacuum, and Hana, as the legal heir, should have stepped into her mother's role. But before she could, Ferdinand declared himself regent, arguing that his daughter's mental state made her unfit to rule. Philip, meanwhile, was still in Flanders. To him, Isabella's death was an opportunity. He raised an army, preparing to march into Spain and claim the throne, not as consort but as king in his own right. Hana, caught between father and husband, became a pawn in their rivalry. Her emotions were no longer private. They were public weapons, used by both sides to argue their case. If she sided with her father, Philip's camp said she was being manipulated. If she sided with Philip, Ferdinand's allies claimed it proved her poor judgment. No matter what she did, she lost. In 1505, the power struggle reached its peak at the Concordia of Salamanca. There, Ferdinand and Philip agreed to rule Castile jointly, with Hana's consent presented as a mere formality. She was physically present, but politically invisible. Decisions were made around her, not by her. She was queen in name, but her will was disregarded. The irony was bitter: the woman who legally owned the crown was treated as if her voice did not matter. Philip's ambitions grew bolder. He surrounded himself with Flemish advisors, alienated the Spanish nobility, and dismissed Hana as a figurehead. He treated her crown as his property, her authority as his to wield. Ferdinand, meanwhile, plotted his return, refusing to yield his influence entirely. And caught between them, Hana's identity was slowly erased. The crown that should have freed her had become her cage. She was trapped in a story she did not write, cast as the Mad Queen in a play directed by the men who sought to control her. Her grief, her passion, her very humanity, everything that made her real, was twisted into evidence against her. The trap was tightening. And soon, it would close completely. In the summer of 1506, Spain seemed poised to enter a new chapter. Philip the Handsome, with his army and his courtiers, had secured recognition as King of Castile, ruling alongside Hana. For months, he strutted across the stage of Spanish politics as though the crown were his alone. Hana was present, always by his side, but her words went unheard, her presence reduced to ceremony. She had endured years of betrayal, manipulation, and humiliation. Yet despite it all, she still clung to Philip, bound by the same desperate devotion that had defined their marriage from the start. But fate was not finished with her. In September 1506, Philip suddenly fell ill after a game of pelota, a popular court sport. Within days, he was dead. He was just 28 years old. The official cause was said to be a fever, perhaps typhoid, though rumors of poisoning swirled immediately. Some blamed Ferdinand, who had every reason to eliminate his ambitious son-in-law. Others suspected Philip's own reckless lifestyle had caught up with him. But whatever the truth, the man Hana had loved and suffered for, the man who was both her greatest passion and her deepest torment, was gone. The shock shattered her. For days, Hana refused to leave his bedside. She spoke to his body as if he were still alive, stroked his hair, whispered that he was only sleeping and would soon awaken. Her attendants pleaded with her to eat, to rest, but she would not. She clung to him as though her touch could summon him back from death. For a woman who had loved with such ferocity and been betrayed so cruelly, denial was her only defense against unbearable grief. Her reaction was natural, even predictable. But to her enemies, it was a gift. Word spread quickly through Spain and across Europe: the Queen of Castile had gone mad. Reports claimed she would not allow Philip's body to be buried, that she insisted on traveling with his coffin from Burgos to Granada. Along the journey, it was said, she kept nightly vigils beside the coffin, speaking to it as though her husband still lived. She supposedly forbade any woman from approaching it, out of jealous suspicion even beyond the grave. Most shockingly, she was accused of ordering the procession to travel only at night, as if her mind had lost all tether to reality. Each of these claims became part of the legend of Hana the Mad. But the truth was far more complicated. Yes, Hana did insist on accompanying Philip's body to Granada, in accordance with his own burial wishes. Yes, she remained close to the coffin, guarding it with a devotion born of both love and despair. But the most sensational details, the jealous rages, the nocturnal travels, the whispered conversations with the dead, came largely from accounts written by those with every reason to portray her as insane. Ferdinand, who had returned to power as regent, encouraged such stories. Every word that painted his daughter as unfit provided him with justification to exclude her from power permanently. And so, what should have been understood as grief was rebranded as madness. Along the route south, Hana did not collapse entirely into delusion. Contemporary evidence shows she made practical decisions about the journey, organized financial arrangements, and even maintained some political correspondence. But these rational acts were ignored or dismissed. The image of the mad queen walking by a coffin was simply too powerful, too useful to the men who controlled her. When the procession finally halted, it was not at Granada, but at the town of Tordesillas. There, under the pretense of allowing Hana time to recover, Ferdinand ordered that she remain, indefinitely. The town would become her prison, and the coffin of Philip the Handsome, the symbol of her broken love, would remain nearby for years. The confinement was presented as care. Officially, Hana was being protected from herself, given time to mourn, shielded from the responsibilities of rule until her mind was sound again. But in reality, it was a cage. Every servant in her household reported to Ferdinand. Every visitor was screened. Her letters were intercepted. Her daily routines were carefully controlled, with the goal not of healing but of reinforcing the image of her instability. In the early months of her imprisonment, Hana tried to resist. She wrote letters to nobles reminding them of their allegiance to her as their rightful queen. She demanded access to documents, sought to issue royal orders, and attempted to assert her authority. Yet these actions, perfectly reasonable for a reigning monarch, were dismissed as further proof of delusion. The more she fought for her rights, the deeper the narrative of madness dug its roots. Perhaps the cruelest tactic was the use of her children against her. Her youngest children, Ferdinand and Catalina, were allowed occasional visits, but always under strict supervision. These brief reunions were meant not to comfort her, but to remind her that her access to them depended entirely on obedience. Her eldest son, Charles, was raised away from her, molded by Ferdinand and later by Flemish courtiers to see his mother as dangerous, unstable, and unfit. The boy who should have been her ally was turned into another instrument of control. Outside her prison, the legend grew. Foreign ambassadors sent back lurid tales of the queen who slept beside her husband's coffin, who raged at invisible enemies, who refused to bathe or eat for days. Whether these stories were true, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated hardly mattered. They were repeated until they became fact. Across Europe, the name Hana the Mad became fixed, a convenient label that justified her exclusion from power and erased the possibility of sympathy. And yet, beneath the layers of rumor and propaganda, a different Hana still existed. Ambassadors who met her privately sometimes wrote of her dignity, her intelligence, her ability to converse on theology and politics with clarity. Some guards expressed doubt about her supposed insanity, noting that she seemed rational in conversation. Religious figures acknowledged her knowledge and devotion. But these voices were drowned out by the chorus of those invested in maintaining the fiction. By turning her grief into madness, Ferdinand achieved what he wanted: control of Castile. Hana was queen in name only, her authority suspended indefinitely, her life reduced to the narrow confines of Tordesillas. The coffin of Philip, which she had once guarded as a symbol of undying love, became the cornerstone of her captivity. It was not just a husband she mourned, but the last remnants of freedom, dignity, and trust. The legend of the Mad Queen had been born, and it would haunt her for the rest of her days. What history often forgets is the humanity at the heart of it all. Hana of Castile was not insane. She was a woman shattered by betrayal, crushed under the weight of dynastic ambition, and suffocated by the political manipulation of those closest to her. Her devotion, her grief, her love, qualities that should have inspired compassion, were twisted into a weapon against her. Philip the Handsome had died young, but Hana's tragedy was only beginning. When Hana of Castile entered the fortress convent of Tordesillas in 1509, she was 30 years old. By law and by blood, she was Queen of Castile, rightful heir to Aragon, and one of the most powerful sovereigns in Europe. But in practice, she was a prisoner, placed under lock and key by her father Ferdinand, later by her son Charles, and finally by her grandson Philip II. The confinement was cloaked in the language of care. She was protected, sheltered, and guarded for her own good. But the reality was harsher. For the next 46 years, she would live in a gilded cage, watched, manipulated, and slowly erased. At first, there was the pretense of dignity. Hana was given a household, servants, and chaplains. She had attendants to dress her, to bring her food, to carry her messages. But every one of them answered to someone else. Spies filled her chambers, recording her words, noting her actions, twisting her every attempt at authority into proof of madness. Her letters were intercepted, her visitors screened. She was queen only within the walls of her confinement, and even there, her authority was hollow. Hana did not submit easily. In the early years, she resisted with the stubbornness of a rightful monarch. She wrote letters to nobles across Castile, reminding them of their sworn allegiance. She demanded to see state documents, attempted to issue decrees, and insisted that government affairs be brought before her. These were not delusions. They were the rightful actions of a queen. But each attempt was reported as further evidence of her instability. Her insistence on exercising power was reframed as obsession, her written words dismissed as the ramblings of a madwoman. Perhaps the cruelest tool of control was the manipulation of her role as a mother. Hana bore 6 children with Philip, and her maternal devotion was as fierce as her love for him had once been. But after his death, her children were gradually taken from her orbit. The younger ones, Ferdinand and Catalina, were allowed occasional visits, brief, orchestrated moments designed less to comfort her than to remind her how little control she truly had. Her elder children, particularly her son Charles, were raised away from her influence. Courtiers whispered to him of her madness, teaching him to view her not as a queen to be honored but as a liability to be contained. This manipulation was devastating. Hana's instinct was to protect her children, to bind them with loyalty and affection. But that instinct was used against her. Any request to see them, any tears shed in their absence, was interpreted as instability. Her love was transformed into the very justification for keeping them from her. Over the decades, the conditions of her confinement hardened. At first, she still had a modest court around her. But as years passed, her household shrank. Servants were dismissed, privileges removed, her movements restricted. Where once she had been allowed to walk in the gardens, she was eventually confined to her chambers. Guards monitored her day and night. The rhythm of her days, meals, prayers, even moments of silence, was controlled by those who claimed to care for her. The irony was cruel. The very treatment meant to prove her madness eventually broke her spirit. Isolation, gaslighting, and endless surveillance chipped away at her sense of reality. At times she remained lucid, sharp, and dignified. Foreign ambassadors occasionally recorded encounters in which Hana spoke with intelligence and composure, displaying a knowledge of theology and politics that belied the rumors of her insanity. Religious figures admired her faith, noting her devotion in prayer and her theological insight. Even some guards doubted the narrative, writing quietly that she seemed sane when treated with respect. But these moments were drowned out by the louder voices invested in the fiction of her madness. For Ferdinand, maintaining the image of a mad queen allowed him to hold Castile until his death in 1516. For Charles, her eldest son, the fiction justified his rise to power as Holy Roman Emperor and ruler of a vast global empire. For Philip II, her grandson, the myth was already too entrenched to undo. Throughout Spain, Hana's name became shorthand for instability. Even when rebels rose against Charles in 1520 during the Comuneros revolt, claiming to act in her name as the legitimate queen, the uprising was crushed, and their invocation of her authority was reinterpreted as yet another sign of her dangerous political influence. She was useful both as a symbol and as a scapegoat, but never as a sovereign. The years ground her down. By the 1530s, she had lived in confinement for more than 2 decades. The once vibrant young woman who spoke multiple languages and asked daring questions had grown pale and weary. Some visitors described her as silent for long stretches, retreating into herself. Was this silence a symptom of genuine decline? Or was it the only act of resistance left to her, a refusal to perform for the spies and courtiers who twisted her every word? History cannot say. By the 1540s, she was frail, her health failing under the weight of neglect. She rarely left her chambers, rarely spoke to those around her. She, who had once loved so fiercely, now lived in a world of shadows, abandoned by those who had promised to love and protect her. The same men who had built their empires on her inheritance ensured that she would never again taste freedom. On April 12, 1555, at the age of 75, Hana of Castile died in her prison at Tordesillas. She had spent 46 years in confinement, more than half her life. Official notices of her death described her as a tragic but necessary figure, a queen whose madness had made her imprisonment unavoidable. Her funeral was a modest affair, stripped of the grandeur befitting a monarch. She, who had once been the rightful heir to the most powerful throne in Europe, was buried with less ceremony than many nobles of lesser rank. Even in death, her dignity was denied. The tragedy of Hana's captivity was not just her own suffering, but the systematic destruction of her identity. She had been a brilliant child, a passionate wife, a devoted mother, and a rightful queen. Yet her story was rewritten by others, her humanity erased and replaced with the caricature of a madwoman. For centuries, history accepted this version, repeating the myth of Hana the Mad as though it were truth. But behind the myth lies a darker truth: Hana was not destroyed by madness. She was destroyed by power, by a father who feared her independence, by a husband who exploited her devotion, by a son who found it easier to rule without her. Her confinement was not an act of mercy, but a masterclass in political manipulation. 46 years in captivity turned her life into one of the longest and most unjust imprisonments in European history. It was not her madness that required her confinement, but the ambitions of men who could not tolerate a woman holding both power and passion. And so the queen who never truly ruled became a prisoner in her own kingdom, her story twisted into legend. But if we look past the propaganda, past the whispers and the lies, we see not a madwoman, but a woman silenced, a woman whose greatest crime was to be both powerful and human in an age that demanded she be neither. When Hana of Castile died in April of 1555, she left behind not only the crown she never truly wore but also one of the darkest legacies of political manipulation in European history. For 46 years she had lived in confinement, silenced by the very men who claimed to act in her best interest. At the time of her death, the official narrative was already sealed: Hana had been a tragic, unstable queen whose madness made her unfit to rule. Her imprisonment was portrayed as mercy, her silence as necessity, and her erasure as protection for the kingdom. But history is rarely that simple. In the immediate aftermath, little effort was made to honor her as queen. Her funeral was modest, stripped of the grandeur owed to the sovereign of Castile and Aragon. She was buried with less ceremony than many minor nobles, her memory reduced to a cautionary tale of female fragility. The story of Hana the Mad spread across Europe, carried in letters, chronicles, and diplomatic reports. For generations, she was remembered not as the rightful queen she was, but as a woman broken by her own passions. This version of her life suited those who inherited her power. Ferdinand of Aragon died confident that he had secured Spain's future without leaving it in the hands of his unstable daughter. Charles V, her son, became Holy Roman Emperor and ruler of a global empire, legitimized in part by the claim that his mother was too unfit to govern. Philip II, her grandson, would rule the most powerful monarchy in Europe, built on the empire she had inherited yet never controlled. None of them had any interest in revisiting her reputation. To do so would have been to question the foundations of their own authority. And so the fiction persisted. For centuries, textbooks repeated the same lurid details: that she wandered Spain with her husband's corpse, that she raged with jealousy even at the dead, that she lost her mind to grief. Artists painted her as a madwoman, novels romanticized her tragedy, and generations of readers accepted the myth without question. Hana became less a historical figure than a legend, a warning about the dangers of female passion, a justification for the patriarchal order of her age. But buried beneath the propaganda, fragments of the truth survived. Letters written by ambassadors spoke of a woman both intelligent and articulate. Accounts from religious figures described her knowledge of theology and her dignity in prayer. Even some of her jailers admitted doubts: noting that she seemed sane when treated with respect. Over time, these fragments began to attract the attention of scholars who questioned the traditional narrative. In the modern era, historians have re-examined her life with new eyes. They have uncovered how the concept of female hysteria was used to silence inconvenient women, how grief was pathologized when expressed by a queen, and how political ambition shaped the narrative of her madness. They have recognized the gaslighting at work long before the term existed, the systematic campaign to make Hana doubt her own sanity while convincing the world that cruelty was kindness. Seen through this lens, Hana's story is no longer one of personal failure but of systemic injustice. She was not destroyed by madness but by the refusal of her world to allow a woman to hold both power and passion. Her intelligence was rebranded as delusion, her love as obsession, her grief as insanity. In truth, these qualities revealed not weakness but humanity, the very humanity that threatened those who sought to control her. The tragedy of Hana of Castile is not only that she suffered, but that her suffering was used to write a story that outlived her by centuries. The label, the Mad Queen, became one of the most successful character assassinations in European history, shaping perceptions of her for half a millennium. Even today, her name is often mentioned with the epithet, mad, a reminder of how deeply entrenched such narratives can become. Yet her story also offers something more, a mirror for our own times. It forces us to ask how often societies have disguised oppression as protection, how often genuine emotion has been dismissed as instability, how often women who refused silence have been branded as dangerous. It asks us to reconsider how history is written, and whose voices are erased in the process. In Hana's case, the price of being both powerful and human was lifelong imprisonment. But her legacy, once obscured, is being reclaimed. Scholars now describe her not as La Loca, but as a victim of one of history's most calculated campaigns of gaslighting. She is remembered not as a madwoman who dragged a coffin across Spain, but as a queen who was denied her crown by the ambition of the men closest to her. Her life reveals a painful truth, that love itself can be weaponized, that grief can be turned into a political tool, and that power can corrupt even the most intimate bonds between husband and wife, father and daughter, mother and son. The final image of Hana of Castile is not the madwoman of legend, but the quiet figure of a queen who lived and died in captivity. A woman who never renounced her title, who never ceased to be the lawful sovereign of Spain, even as she was silenced in her own chambers. Her endurance, her survival across 46 years of confinement, testifies not to madness but to resilience. In the end, Hana's story is not simply a tragedy. It is a warning. It teaches us how easily truth can be distorted when it serves power, how quickly a woman's emotions can be rebranded as instability, and how dangerous it can be to inherit authority in a world that believes authority should belong only to men. She deserves to be remembered not as Hana the Mad, but as Hana of Castile, a queen betrayed by those she trusted, a woman whose humanity was turned into her prison, and a victim of one of the most devastating lies of her age.